Okay, thanks everyone for coming. So my name's Rathi, I'm the chair of the Socialist Health Association. If you don't know us, we're an organisation that campaigns against privatisation of the NHS primarily, but we also campaign on kind of wider social determinants of health, including the topic we're going to talk about today. And if you want to learn more about us, there's lots of literature on the back as well. Without further ado, I will introduce our speakers. The format will be, after each speaker, everyone will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then there will be some time for Q&A before we move on. So our first speaker is Jatinder Hayre, Dr. Jatinder Hayre, who's also a vice chair and has published few kind of public health research articles, including articles on the impact of Sure Start, and has also released a book earlier this year on the impact of COVID on the younger generation. So feel free to ask him as well. But Jatinder, over to you.
So just to capitalise on what Rathi mentioned, so I'll just be discussing today about some of the social determinants of health amongst children, and also going into early years investments, specifically Sure Start as well. So I've just prepared a bit of a speech that kind of captures that sentiment, and then time for a Q&A afterwards as well. So just to start off, child poverty, first of all, child poverty is not a misfortune, and it's not an accident of circumstance. That's very important to mention. It is a direct consequence of political choice. Today, more than 4 million children in the United Kingdom live in relative poverty, and a third of our young population condemned to lives marked by insecurity, hunger, and diminished horizons. And this is not fate. It is the outcome of decisions taken in Westminster. Decisions to cut, to privatise, to retreat from the public realm. And the numbers are stark. Since 2010, funding for children's services has fallen by nearly a third, with the deepest cuts imposed on the very communities least able to bear them. And I'll just use an example here. In the Northeast, funding was slashed by 34%. And if you contrast that with the leafy suburbs of the Southeast, it was just 22%. And behind those figures are families forced into temporary accommodation, children queuing at food banks, parents making impossible choices between heating and eating. Now, this is phraseology that you would think would be consigned to Victorian-era England, but here we are in 2025 discussing it under a Labour government, which I think is shameful to say the least. And austerity has written inequity into the fabric of childhood. I think there's been a real betrayal of childhood over the last 15 years or so, and there's been no attempt, I believe, in the last year to catch up with that. And then came COVID-19. Now, for children, and I'm sure Ian is the expert on this, and so is Rathi, the virus itself was rarely fatal, but the response magnified the injustice caused by it. Schools were closed, services vanished, loneliness spread, and it was the poorest who paid twice, one for a decade of austerity, and again for the pandemic. And let us be clear, I'll say it again, poverty is not only an economic condition, it is a social determinant of health. It shortens lives, increases diseases, and damages minds. And children from the poorest households are 4 times more likely to suffer serious mental ill health by the age of 11. Homelessness corrodes emotional stability. Food insecurity weakens immunity and fuels obesity. Educational divides set life trajectory before adulthood even begins. And these are not marginal concerns, they're the determinants of life expectancy itself. And herein lies the issue. We know what works. We know because we once did it in the Labour Party. Sure Start was one of the most visionary policies ever implemented by a government. At its peak, over 3,600 centres formed a universal fabric of early years support, with outreach, play, childcare, health advice, and tailored family support. It recognised the earliest years of life are decisive, what UNICEF called the first 1,000 days. And that's what economists call the greatest return on investment. And what we as doctors know is the foundation of lifelong health. And the evidence is unequivocal. In my recent research in the BMJ, we found that Sure Start reduced hospitalizations, cut accidental injuries, improved dental health, boosted breastfeeding rates amongst disadvantaged women, strengthened educational attainments, and surprisingly, even stabilized and improved neurodevelopmental disorders like ADHD and conduct disorder. And when funding was cut to short start centres, we found that obesity rates rose proportionally. So let us be honest with ourselves. Yes, the Blair Brown years had many shortcomings. From foreign policy to creeping privatisation. But on child poverty, they did deliver. Short Start worked, it mitigated inequity, it generated health, and it changed life chances. And it was our movement, our party, that achieved it. We can't denigrate away from that. But where are we now is the question. Too cautious, too managerial, and too willing to speak of fairness in abstractions without the boldness of redistributive policy. Poverty is rising under a Labour government. Services are hollowed out under a Labour government, and child welfare is slipping down the agenda if it was ever on the agenda to begin with. We are not doing enough, and history will not forgive us for timidity amongst. The task before us is not tinkering at the edges. We must demand a new settlement, restore and expand Short Start, universal in reach, but proportionally targeted to those most in need, and that's what we mean by equity. End the scandal of children in temporary accommodation, guarantee food security so no child goes hungry in the holidays, and rebuild welfare so that work is truly a route out of poverty and not just another form of it. And invest in mental health services that reach the poorest first. Poverty is political, but so is its abolition. If politics is about priorities, let us be clear. We put children first, not as a slogan, but as a structural commitment, and that's what it has to be. It is intolerable that children's health and opportunities are still preordained by the postcodes into which they are born. Our predecessors showed us that bold policy can change that. Our obligation is to go further still. Because when we get the early years right, we do not only change childhood, we change society itself.
Does anyone have any questions for Jatinder? Teresa?
Yeah, could I just ask, because I'm not a Labour Party member, I'm not a Labour Party member, I don't think people are challenging West Streeting enough, and every time I heard him saying, we're tackling poverty and we're going to make sure that children get breakfast or lunch at school because we don't want kids going to school with empty bellies. Well, by not removing the 2-child cap, the children at home who are not at school or nursery have got empty bellies. But people were not challenging that. They allowed his narrative to run. And I just want to know, because I'm not at conference, are people challenging him? Because he seems to be getting away with whatever he's saying, and it's just so annoying.
I think amongst the party membership, the 2-child cap on child benefit is universally disliked. And you are absolutely right. It robs parents of the agency. And I think it's rooted in this old stigma that if you were to remove it, you'd have working class people having too many kids. And you know, it's that old fashioned stigma. And the evidence is absolutely. It's an old-fashioned conservative narrative that I remember that you see splashed over the right-wing tabloids. It was an absolute disgrace. The evidence is unequivocal. Unconditional cash transfers, wherever they've been trialled in North America, across Europe, solve child poverty, and that should be the crux of it. And you should be giving parents that agency. And you know, the evidence speaks for itself, and we should be led by the evidence. And it's a shame that we're not doing as much. I think it costs £1 billion. May have to double check this. It costs £1 billion, I think, to reverse that policy. However, it has the possibility of lifting 800,000 children out of poverty, and that's a huge amount. So the return on investment you get is absolutely massive.
And the Short Starts are in childminder service now. There's no substance.
And you know, this is political short-termism. they're thinking in a single parliamentary cycle, but actually, if you look at this from a life course theory, if you were to invest in those early years, for every £1 you spend in the first 1,000 days, across a lifetime, you'll get £4 back on your investment. And that's an economic argument, but also there's a really moral obligation here. You shouldn't be condemning children to poverty in that lifetime of poverty, and from sort of life expectancy, health expectancy even. So yeah, it's a real moral obligation as well as an economic argument to be made on that.
Charlotte, and then gentlemen, and then ladies.
I think perhaps there is some, well, I'm just going to start, yes, the two child cap is an abomination. But I think there is some possible rays of hope, though I'm interested really to hear from you in Bridget Phillipson talking about the better start in life, which seems to be something of a sure start 2.0.
Rebranding, yes. Yeah.
I'm very interested if any of you have experience of this so far. I know it's very new. Breakfast clubs, and of course now the 30 hours of care. So first of all, I'm just interested if you have any experience, but my other question is, this has all been framed as an education issue by education ministers. How do you see yourselves, as doctors and health workers, working with education to provide the best services if we have Sure Start 2.0?
Yeah, well, this is an interesting point, and I think the problem you have in government, and I speak purely as someone that looks from the outside in, from a medical perspective almost. Michael Marmot talks about, the sort of eminent public health doctor talks about health in all policies. One of the big criticisms he has when it comes to policies to tackle child poverty and poverty as a whole is too much disjointed thinking within government. There's not enough sort of collaboration between different government departments, not enough communication either. I think the way to conceptualize health is that health generation happens across what we call the social determinants of health. So that'll be education, it'll be housing, it'll be the way people interact with their neighborhoods and their communities as well. Health generation is a very complicated thing. And I think we can all say here that health is not generated in hospitals. It's not generated by us. It's developed and generated in the community. So my conceptualization of that is that what you need is collaborative government departments that deliver health in all domains and all policies. And that will be the way to really tackling and treating poverty in childhood and health inequity in childhood.
Thanks, Jatinder. I might just, because we will hear from education at the end, and then we might come back to this actually. Sorry, yes.
Yeah, I have been to the conference, well, to the Fringes. I've heard lots of MPs and some ministers who would fundamentally agree with pretty much everything you said, particularly about the joining upness. In terms of getting it to really happen, I mean, I don't think there's anybody in the Labour Party who actually would defend the 2-child limits, not that I've ever met anyway. But in terms of getting it to actually happen, is the association able to mobilise some more doctors? Because doctors are really very politically powerful, although many of them don't really appreciate that. And in particular, all this poverty in families, it's the health service and social care picks up the crap, isn't it? Can we quantify that? Could we demonstrate that spending an extra £1 billion on child benefit and stuff would relieve the health service of quite a lot of burden? Could we count it somehow?
Yeah. On the political power of doctors, I think some of the medical establishment and institutions of Royal Colleges, for example, I know the Royal College of Paediatricians does fantastic work actually, but I do think they're a bit of an outlier when it comes to the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons and whatnot. There is this sort of old-fashioned attitude of leaving politics at the door. And focusing
I
on
want local doctors.
local doctors. Okay.
The Royal College of whatever it is great, but I want my local doctor to be on the front page of the paper, really.
I think medicine is fundamentally a political science, as much as it is an actual science in itself. There's a really good sort of quote by an eminent doctor, Rudolf Virchow, that I really believe in, and as doctors are attorneys of the poor. Now, somewhere that has been lost, and there is a depoliticization of the medical profession, and that's happened over a period of decades, I think. I think doctors have a bit of a diminished voice in today's society, actually, when it comes to speaking about these issues. But you are right. We do need to speak up more about this. And the way I think the best way I think of going about this is actually, I know you talk about local doctors, local voices and local empowerment, but I think as a collective we are most powerful, and it comes from the medical establishment and the existing institutions. The Royal Colleges are powerful things. And I think we need to follow the sort of role that the Royal College of Paediatricians has forward for themselves with a big and powerful voice on child poverty and the social determinants of health. We don't do that so much in other institutions or colleges, so I think that's where it has to come from. And your second question, sorry, in terms of quantifying.
Yes, whether is it possible? I mean, I'm not sure you can, but if we could demonstrate that the costs on other services exceeded the cost of giving these people the money.
Yes.
And the other obvious issue, if you give poor people money, they'll spend it. If we want to, boost the economy.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Those unconditional cash transfers, absolutely. They have economic benefit, but they're also poverty alleviating measures. So there is quite a lot of evidence out there, actually, that poverty does have a big impact on the health service. If you look at asthma, for example, we know that disproportionately poorer people, poorer children or children from poorer families, do get more asthma exacerbations. They also have a higher risk of death from asthma as well, as inpatients. So we know that the health service picks up the sort of collateral damage of poverty. And there's a lot of evidence on that across different spectrums of diseases. Now, the gap comes on what measures do we take to actually alleviate those and address those, and that's a political question, a question of political will.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Jatinder. I think this might be a really good point to move on to an actual local doctor, actually. So
Just say very quickly that the Guardian is reporting that Rachel Rees is going to lift the two-child benefit cap in the November budget. Yes, I mean, there's a. Read the article, but there are caveats,
How are there?
Well, she might put a cap on 3 or 4 children, but yeah, there is movement but there's movement in the right
direction.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'd just like to move on to introduce our next speaker, who is Professor Ian Sinha, who's a respiratory paediatrician at Hayre and an honorary professor of child health at the University of Liverpool, and holds various national leadership roles in paediatric asthma and respiratory disease, and leads a research group evaluating strategies to reduce preventable respiratory disease and death in the UK and abroad, and actually also close associated with Ian Byrne, and I said as well.
Yes.
So yeah, Ian, we'll see you in 4 years.
Thank you for asking me to speak with this absolutely wonderful group. I've met with many of you before. And Rathi and I did our PhDs together a billion years ago, and it was such a pleasure to work with you then. And I'm so pleased to see you are the voice of common sense when it comes to children. You and your wonderful group. And it's also very energizing hearing what you're doing. And there's a generation of researchers and clinicians coming through, ready to take the fight, and we need it, because I'm tired. I'm tired because I work in the NHS, which is beleaguered. I'm tired because I've got 2 teenage daughters, keep me on my toes, and I'm tired of banging my head against a brick wall. But what you've just said is the result of banging your head against a brick wall, and you're right. Nowadays people wouldn't say, oh, there's a, people generally wouldn't defend that cap. But I'm old enough to remember 12 months ago when people were saying Thatcher, and we were watching a Labour Party entrenched in this idea that it was people's fault that they were poor. And one of the most important things that you said was that poverty is not a natural thing. It doesn't fall out of the sky, we make it.
Yeah.
And for the next sort of few minutes, I just want to give you sort of my insights as a paediatrician. I've never been a member of the Labour Party, never been a member of any party. And the reason for that is that I think children are just more important than party politics. And I always start my talks on child poverty by saying something that's actually not that socialist. You know, socialism is grounded that we're all equal. And I believe that to a point. I believe that children are the most important and precious thing that we have in this universe. And everything that we should do should be, you know, should be about them. For me, everything else is only important in so much as it pertains to children in some way. So, and that's partly because I'm not intelligent enough to hold more than 3 thoughts in my head. So as paediatricians, our guiding focus is not only are children the most important group in the world, they're possibly the only important thing. And yet we live in a country which Professor Sir Michael Marmot, who's a wonderful collaborator, has said is the case example of how not to tackle health inequality. And he bases that on the fact that if you look over time, generally speaking, we live longer than our grandparents, except in 21st century Britain, where if you are particularly a woman in a deprived area, your life expectancy is receding in one of the richest economies that we've ever had. And that's, you know, we're also seeing these record levels of child poverty. And the key point that I want to make over the next few minutes is the idea that poverty is completely pervasive and systemic problems need systemic solutions. And when we look at this idea of poverty being pervasive, we see the outcomes on health. And it's, you know, for 10 years, people have been telling me, oh, I've translated our obesity sheets into Bengali. And I'm like, would you think that will help? When you look at the steps involved in sitting down with your family and having a healthy meal at each step of the model? And we developed a methodology around it, which we call the 3C model of clock, capacity, and cost. And at each step there, people, and by people specifically, I mean mothers, who have the least in their pocket, are limited in their choice. So if we limit our most deprived communities to ultra-processed, high-calorie, dense food that you can transport easily, buy quickly, and store in a cupboard, why are we even vaguely surprised that compared to the richest and most affluent, least deprived kids, our rates of obesity are going like that? We do have a public health crisis for obesity, and it is largely centered on the poorest children and non-white children. And it's really important that we take this idea that poverty doesn't, you know, we fall into this idea that things like air pollution affect us all equally. They don't. We know through history that the key point about vulnerability is that you're more likely to be hit with a problem, and you're less likely to be able to get yourself out of it. We saw it in the pandemic, we saw it in Titanic, one ship, one iceberg, and yet the people traveling third class were 3 times more likely to drown. We saw it in Hurricane Katrina, we saw it in the Black Plague, we see it right through history that vulnerability in terms of resource comes down to this idea that you are limited in your choice of how to get yourself out of the situation. We worked with the Royal College of Paediatrics, who you mentioned before, to develop a toolkit and a strategy around child poverty. And one of the things that we said with regards to poverty and health is that it's not immediately intuitive to people why poverty and health should be linked. You know, as you've said, about centuries of everyone actually knowing this, but saying that these two things are linked is more a 21st century thing, really. It's at the fore now. Again, you know, now you can't go anywhere without an NHS manager talking to you about inequalities. I'm old enough to remember 6 years ago, people would just say, sit down, Lefty, you know, is there a magic money tree? And we'd say, there is a magic money tree. Yeah. It's called taxing the Times rich list to give money to people who cannot afford to keep their children safe. And the intergenerational trauma that comes from this also runs deep. The 4 mechanisms that we said link poverty with child health inequalities are number one, people are priced out of giving their families a healthy start in life, and that these adverse exposures don't drop one by one, they are intrinsically linked. The third thing that we said was that there's an inverse care law, which I'll come on to, and finally we talk about the pathobiology of poverty. I just want to address these in reverse order. So the first is the pathobiology of poverty. We used to say poverty gets under your skin. There is now increasing evidence of the epigenetic changes of poverty. In other words, up to 10% of the function of your DNA is changed in the first 2 years of life and lived in deprived circumstances, both in terms of the structure and function of your DNA. The very atoms and molecules that make us who we are can be affected by the situations in which we live. I'm going to jump back to the first two and I always give this example because I think it just explains and depicts how pervasive the poverty is. But if we think about housing, right, again, I'm old enough to remember when people said in 2019, housing isn't the issue that you think it is. And I remember that it took that, and people used, ministers used to say to us, you can't change the regulation until someone dies. And someone did die, little Al-Abishak, a lovely, beautiful little boy died in accommodation that's not fit for an animal. And when we think about housing, it costs £1. We did a report with Michael Marmot's group about cold homes, and we said, right, well, we've published the evidence, we've done a systematic review showing the impact of poor housing on respiratory health. We did this report saying that there were structural problems. One of those was that it costs it costs 74 pence out of every pound if you live in decile 10, in the poorest decile, to heat your house. And actually, the Food Foundation showed us that it costs 74 pence out of every pound to feed your family according to government guidelines. So if you're paying £1.48 out of every pound in your pocket, something's going to give, and that something is the opportunities for children, and families, particularly mothers, are making huge sacrifices to keep their families afloat. We then went on to say and start to change the narrative about cold homes. Rightly people think about the elderly in cold homes at winter where we have a high excess death rate, but we also said this is a massive problem for children. Cold homes are not an inconvenience. When you look at, and this explains one of the key tenets of paediatrics perfectly, is that if you look at what happens in childhood, your lungs, your brain, whatever, you build for the first 20 years of your life, particularly for the first 2 to 3 years of your life. That's when your lungs grow at their fastest. Then you hit high school and you sort of grow a bit. Then you hit your early 20s and then everything goes south. Nothing works better in me now at 46 than it did 25 years ago. So childhood gives us this window of opportunity to develop into the people that we know these children can become. And yet what we find is that, this month, this winter, the children in Liverpool going home to the warmest houses will spend their calories on trying to grow and develop lung tissue, neural pathways, liver tissue. The infants going home to the coldest houses will just spend their calories trying not to die of hypoglycemia and hypothermia. The tracks are set before they're born, which is what the Barker hypothesis tells us, that developmental origins of health and safety, and they look like this from day one. So it's not a surprise that these things cause problems. And when we think about the inverse care law, this happens at all different types of levels. So it happens at policy level. You mentioned about austerity. Austerity is like everything else. It didn't hit us equally. Austerity per head hit the poorest and most northern towns and cities the most. And these were the places where people were already dying early. But even when we look within the health service, we see that the outcomes of diabetes are worse in the poorest groups, and yet they're the group least likely to have access to the kinds of technology that can be life-changing for people with diabetes. I won't take up too much more time other than to say that systemic problems need systemic solutions, and we've been doing some stuff that's now nationally and internationally lauded, and yet I'm the first person to hold my hands up and say we're just scratching the surface. When we're developing the sorts of clinics and interventions that can help, some of them in the community, some of them in hospital, like our clean air clinic, all we're doing is scratching the surface. what really comes from that is that we're able to start advocating for children. And I'll finish on what I think are the four key things to advocate and shout about. One is the 2-child cap, and maybe next year we're shouting about the 3-child cap, or the 4-child cap, or whatever finger in the air arbitrarily. So, we should be arguing for people, particularly children and the pregnant women, to breathe clean air. They are the least producers of air pollution, and yet they're the most likely to be exposed to it and suffer the most problems. We should be advocating and shouting for universal free school meals, because one of the key underlying problems that we have is that all these problems stem from from up top. Stigma is the machinery of inequality, and if you take out the stigma, if we take out the systemic dehumanization of working class communities, we will see the impact on children. And we should be pushing to support financial support for families whose children are sick, because they have a right to be together, and then there's some work going on in that field. So I will finish there, and my key points are this. Number one, poverty is a political choice. Hunger is a political choice. Air pollution is a political choice. And if you prioritise rich adults over children, you will carry on with the same systemic problems that we have always seen. Number two, I would say that there is hope. There is hope in a generation of doctors who have found their voice and need to start to use the data, medical experience, pull together the communities and work with policy makers. And then we'll be in this situation, hopefully we don't just go around in circles again. We'll be in a situation where both in the clinic and the boardroom and the 10 children are not seen as an afterthought, but are seen as this wonderful generation. They are 25% of the population and 100% of the future. And for me, that's where the action lies. Well, thank you.
Thanks so much, Ian. I've heard Ian speak now 3 or 4 times. I never get time to hear him speak. It's really, really powerful. I can take a couple of questions. Yeah, Pat.
Just a quick one. So apart from Ian Byrne, wonderful Ian Byrne, his Right to Food campaign, who else do you think generally gets it at the moment in the Labour Party, who we can...
Do you know, I think a lot of them get it.
Right.
But I think the system and this, I go back to my very first line, children are more important than party politics. And the system, one of the things that we teach our PhD students on day one, and our medical students, we teach them the primary goal of a system, any system, is to look after itself, even at the expense of the people it's trying to help. So people look at the NHS and go, oh, this is about improving child outcomes. It's not. People look at the league table, which Hayre did very well on. We all got a pat on the back and we all went, didn't feel like we're doing a good job at the moment. And actually, it was nothing about us. It was about the finance of the hospital. You know, the whole focus of when people came and clapped for us all in the pandemic, which was actually quite embarrassingly, I didn't like it. My wife sent me out, and she actually did a lot during COVID. But what people were clapping for, I think, was that level of the NHS, which is, you know, people who work on the shop floor in the NHS. What they weren't clapping for was the bureaucracy that is wasting an absolute ton of money. And I don't buy into the idea that there's no money. I know that there's money because I keep seeing emails going, does someone want to bid for this? And I go, that is an inordinate amount of money. And I watch the stuff that they should be funding, our work on child poverty, slipping away with all this money that's found down the back of the sofa, and it goes to fund businesses. And I think people get it, that the structure in the system, you know, speak out on it, and then you'll get suspended from your. You know.
Thanks for that. Yes.
Just a shout out from Wales in terms of apologies. I don't know if anyone else is from Wales here. You talked about Wales.
I haven't, but if I have
Wellbeing,
time, I would
future
say
generation, so all about, but not sure how well it's being converted into the sort of delivery, if you like. But all primary school children now in Wales, all primary school children across 22 local authorities have free school. Well, they have School meal, their school lunch is provided.
Yes,
School lunch is provided.
as it should be.
Provision.
And one of the key things, we do a lot of work with various groups in Wales, and we have a population that covers North Wales. Now we work closely with our colleagues in South Wales. I'm going to Newport in a couple of weeks' time. And one of the key things that and I learned this after I grew up in the Northeast after the Cleveland child sex abuse. I stumbled upon in medical records when I was a medical student, a box that said confidential, do not read this. This is confidential, classified documentation about the Cleveland child sex report. But I took the lid off and asked, what did they say? And one of the key things that came was about the valleys in Wales. And one of the things that we could see playing out in Cleveland and Teesside was stigma, and the other thing was intergenerational trauma. And for me, one of the key things that we're doing I've been working with a professional beatboxer of all people in South Wales, and we're working at this idea of beatbox therapy, where beatboxing in hip hop is actually about breathing and breath control, but it's also about self-expression and self-worth. And I remember one of the things that my dad said when I was very young I was like 6, and the minor stroke was on TV. And I'm kind of paraphrasing, this is how I remember it as an adult. But he said to my mum, you can take everything away from these people, but the killer is when you take away their self-esteem as a community. And that's always stuck with me, because a lot of this, and what Wales, I think, Wales definitely is ahead, and I think, that sort of community view, but I think there needs to be investment and acknowledgement of the idea. Same with coastal towns, same with Blackpool, same with Barrow-in-Furness, same with inner city Birmingham, is an acknowledgement that we have let people down. And as a system, we need to start to address that.
Thanks. Was there another question, Jane?
It's kind of more a comment and a question. So in Cumbria, it was a group of grassroots activists before I was part of the SHA that we pushed for free school meals before we had 2 authorities being brought in. It was brought in, it was watered down. We wanted it across the board, even during school holidays. But it was about 6 of us. I coordinated the meetings, brought together that you can put stuff together if you bug people enough. We as SHA delegates passed a motion on the 2-child benefit cap within our CLP Carlisle, but we were met with heavy resistance. And the underlying context is the idea that there is not money, because that propaganda runs so strong.
Yeah.
And Esther Giles, who's our treasurer, along with Richard Murphy, who's an economist, and he writes about it, dispelling those myths that there is money there, we can tax fairly, we can control inflation, the money's there.
Money's there.
So
the money's there. I do not for a second buy into the idea that there's no money. I don't buy into it 1%. And I think what you've just described there is an absolutely perfect example of how people will use that. Not just to say, they don't even use it in a straight argument. They don't go, oh, here are our figures. They laugh at us and they go, where's your money tree, Corbynista, or whatever they say, as if we're supposed to go, oh my God, there is money. We spend it wrongly. We don't prioritise women and children. We prioritise business. And in Barrow-in-Furness, which is a town in Cumbria, I went up for a couple of days and I didn't have loads of meetings with public health and people in suits. I just spent a couple of days talking to mums in children's centres. It was wonderful. It was the best education I've had about this sort of stuff in a long time. And that was only last year. And Barrow-in-Furness were given £200 million of levelling up money by the Tory government. £200 million. And actually, so I looked through all these documents about their meetings about what they'll spend the money on. The word child came up once, and it was to say children weren't involved in this discussions, right? So I was going, why are you surprised that your children die in tenement buildings? Why are you surprised that your children walk straight into county lines? Why are you surprised that children have to leave the classroom to go and vape? Why are you surprised that you have a low birth weight? Why are you surprised that almost every woman I've spoken to has been either physically or sexually assaulted in their life? And then why are you surprised that they won't let their children go and play outside in this beautiful part of the world? Why are you blaming the people for the systemic problems that have left them in that situation in the first place?
I watched an interview recently, and I can't actually recall what doctor it was, but he had met a young man, a white young man, who was extremely angry, volatile, racist, and he said when he died, he did an autopsy on him, and he said his brain was shriveled.
Yeah.
And that's how can we be surprised then that we're facing the rise of the far right, misogyny is growing, not just casualized racism, but actual white supremacy
Yeah.
is on the rise. When these, you know, you say you're from the northeast, so Hartlepool, reading through the most impacted areas of well, two-child benefit cap and I can't remember another, it's the northern cities and boroughs of London in it. So we can't be surprised that they don't really care about children and they're continuing on.
Some of you were at a talk relatively recently by a colleague of mine, Imogen Tyler, who works at Lancaster University, and she does a talk. We've been talking. She's a sociologist, and we did a lot. We just chat all the time because I love her. And she wrote this book, Studying as a Machinery of Inequality, and she's now moved her research very much into this idea of necroeconomics, that the economics that are pushed on us are things that have fatal consequences. And Hartlepool is a wonderful example of a place where a couple of years ago, when Sunak wanted to build this free port on the River Tees, as someone who grew up in that very ICI place, I have a pathological fear of public water. I won't go in it because I know that my head will fall off, right? Nobody from Middlesbrough goes swimming in the river like we do here, right? And if you look at what happened when they dredged the bottom of the River Tees to make it deeper for the ships to come in, there was a maritime emergency right up and down the northeast coast. And everybody said, well, we need progress. And I was like, at what cost? Life, nature, beauty, love, at what cost do you have this happening here? And that was when I learned that seals in Hartlepool have a lower birth weight than seals in other parts of the country. There's a lovely place there, Seal Sands. And literally, over the road is a town where children have the lowest birth weight and have done for decades. And yet the easiest thing to do is to point to people like us and say, you're the reason I haven't got any money, when actually it's just been misprioritized. And I don't mean not prioritized on children, I mean actively taken away from children and misspent.
Thanks, and just a quick question.
People don't count how expensive poverty is. It's expensive on time because people with few resources have to go around trying to find today's bargain, which will be different from yesterday's bargain, and trying to cobble things together. And there are further expenses down the line. I have a friend who's always been poor. She was born blind at Hayre, with tumours behind both her eyes. And although they managed to save a limited amount of sight in one eye, that's all she's ever had. Nevertheless, with no education, she's managed to bring up her 4 children, plus stepchildren, and managed to keep them all and keep the family together. Her various exes have moved out and so on, but she's managed to keep these in this cluster of children, some of which were hers. Unfortunately, her eldest son, who is in his mid-40s, is at the moment in jail. He's had some disabilities and he has never really had any sustainable employment. He's sort of had liaison with people and he's tried to contribute to those households, more or less successfully at times. However, in the end, he found he could drive, so he was taking drugs from A to B. And when his mother found out about it, she was absolutely shocked. She is scrupulously honest, and she said, you must stop this right away. Then 2 weeks later, the police caught him, and he's now in jail. And she said, he said to her, I was surprised at it, Mum, I've nothing. And I can earn 2,000 a week by taking drugs from A to B. These are the options that
These are the options, and I'm so glad that you raised that idea, because this is what a mum in Barrow said to me. Right? So there's this road in Barrow, and if you step out of your front door, you're on the pavement, and you haven't got a front garden. And I said to this lady, are you worried about bringing up your kids here? She was breastfeeding a baby actually, and I said, I'll tell you the 2 quotes that she said. I said, is it easy to breastfeed in Barrow? And she said, I mean, it really hurt me when she said that. She said, breasts aren't for babies here, they're for men. Right? So there's this systemic misogyny right across the place. Stigma is the machine of inequality. And the second thing I said was, are you worried about your kids growing up here? And she said, and I was kind of talking about the pandemic and how Barrow was badly hit. And she said this line that I'll never forget and has been the focus of what we're trying to do in our research group. She said there was nothing to do before for kids, and now there's less than nothing. So we talk about, and it was a throwaway comment. We said that is the void that gets filled with the stuff that we don't want kids to do.
Yes.
You know, that is the void.
Yeah.
And again, I go, you know, I remember my dad and my favourite band, Rage Against the Machine. The best line of any song is they don't gotta burn the books, they just remove them. You make a void and let the working class communities kill themselves in it. Like that's what they want.
Yeah.
And again, the point about the expense of poverty, and the gentleman over here had asked about this, as well as individual families, poverty, we know we have, you know, it has now been looked at that health inequalities cost the NHS something like £60 billion a year.
Yeah.
And that people in the most deprived areas cost the NHS around £7,000 to £10,000 extra a year. Having poor people is expensive on your NHS. So, you know, we're talking about £3 billion to lift the 2-child cap, and we're talking about 40 billion child poverty in terms of lost income, lost taxes, and increased benefits and public spending. Child poverty per year costs a lifetime cost of £40 billion a year. So we're talking about just, you know, nothing to fix this systemic problem that we go.
Thanks, Ian. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to our next speaker. So we're moving away from doctors, but staying with health and nutrition. I'm very pleased to introduce Elaine Boylan from the British Dental Association. And Elaine leads on scientific and health-related policy and public health at the British Dental Association, covering a wide range of issues such as antimicrobial resistance, addressing inequalities, and sugar reduction. She has a background in public health and nutrition, including in the early years, and has held roles in academic medical research funding and public health organisations. Thanks very much.
Thank you, and I'm delighted to be here. Rathi, thank you so much for inviting me. So as Rathi said, I'm Head of Health Science Policy at the British Dental Association. And I'm just here to talk about the work that we're doing in ensuring children have the best possible start in life. And from an oral health perspective, we are facing an epidemic of tooth decay. Shockingly, this completely preventable condition remains the #1 reason for hospital admissions among children aged 5 to 9 years. On average, about 120 children are admitted to hospital every single working day to have their decayed teeth removed under a general anaesthetic. I still find that quite shocking, to be honest, when I keep saying it. And this costs these children, it's not just pain and stress, but it's their overall well-being, their confidence, mental health, their development. It also leads to time off school for the children, but also time off work for parents and carers. And in terms of, we'll talk about cost to the taxpayer, it costs about £46 million every year. And to put that into context, the very welcome supervised toothbrushing scheme, which has just been rolled out to 500,000 children in England, will cost us over £11 million a year. With more than a fifth of children in England have decay by the time they're 5. And we see like a long-term trend in improving rates, but actually this is reversing in many parts of the country, with 4 regions in England having gone backwards on decay in the last 2 years. Again, as we've spoken about, huge oral health inequalities exist and persist. The rate of decay-related tooth extractions for children and young people in the most deprived areas is nearly 3.5 times that of those in the most affluent areas. So we're seeing the same as what you both have said. And we aren't just seeing inequalities in oral health, but also in other conditions, again, as we mentioned, for example, such as obesity. And the link between poor oral health and poor general health has been increasingly well established. But the way we see it is by reducing the burden of disease, such as tooth decay, periodontal disease, oral cancer, there will be subsequent improvement in other conditions, such as diabetes, cardiovascular health, obesity, along with social mobility, long-term economic benefits. And one of the common risk factors between all these conditions is diet. And, I think we've spoken before, it's not just down to individual choice. Children living in food poverty often face limited access to nutritious food, and face a toxic food environment, leads to a poor diet, low in fruit and vegetables, high in sugar, subsequently poor oral and poor general health. And there's no silver bullet to preventing poor oral health or poor general health, but we need to reduce persistent, unacceptable health inequalities. Any strategy has to include sufficient access to dental care, but also population level measures, and that's to address the risk factors for tooth decay and also other health conditions. and including addressing the sugar content of our food. And this is one of the areas I want to focus on, and it's where the BDA have focused, particularly on commercial baby foods, and the marketing and labelling of these foods. If we talk about, the best start in life, there's an urgent need to better assess and regulate foods and drinks marketed for babies and young children, aged from 0 to 36 months. Like clear nutrient thresholds for energy, protein, fat, sugar, salt. And we need to ensure that these products are developmentally nutritious, but also they don't have excessive harmful ingredients. And this should be the bare minimum for food and drink at this age group, but it's not. We've seen evidence that many baby foods on the UK market contain excessive high sugar. They've got insufficient nutrients, misleading packaging claims that say no added sugar masks the high free sugar content of them. And earlier this year, we undertook a market analysis of the sugar content of over 200 baby food pouches aimed at children under 12 months. And it was shown in April on BBC Panorama programme, still available on iPlayer if you want to catch it. And what we found was that nearly a quarter of products examined contained up to 2/3 of an adult's daily upper limit of free sugar. And I say upper limit, because sometimes it's referred to as a recommend or like a maximum. It's the maximum amount. We're not recommending you have it. Over a quarter of these pouches contain more sugar by volume than Coca-Cola. So parents of infants as young as 4 months were marketing pouches that contain the equivalent of up to 184% of sugar levels of that soft drink. We identified the top brands that were undermining government guidance on weaning from around 6 months. So they were marketing products from 4 months, which is contrary to government guidelines. And they state, every baby is different. They did preempt us, and a couple of them said they would change their labels, and sticking with their angle that every baby was different. And then you've got natural sugar levels, and these are described by manufacturers that it's inevitable with a fruit-based pouch. However, what we showed is that actually it's not necessarily the case. We had some products that were very similar ingredients, and they contained a fraction of sugar levels of the worst offenders. Our analysis also demonstrated the disingenuous language and the halo labelling used on these baby food pouches. Products highlighting the presence of only naturally occurring sugars or the absence of added sugars, and then you had others with opaque claims of nutritionist approved. And it misleads parents who, I think this is a vulnerable group. They're trying to do their best for their child and trying to make the best available choice. But it misleads them into thinking that these are healthy choices. And it's not about whether a parent or a carer can have, it's not about case of doing that. Absolutely, if they want to have purchase the baby food pouch, but it's about transparency whenever they're purchasing these products, and to make sure that they're making the healthiest choice available. And if we've got misleading claims, then that's not available to them. There was one product, and it was Kittylicious, and they offered a bedtime blend. So it was 13 grams of sugar per portion, suggesting it was appropriate for things. And it's all suggestive, so they're allowed to do this. We've got immune support was one of them as well. And I find it very frustrating because they are allowed to say it, but it's the suggestive element to it. And the things have only got worse. We did this analysis in 2022 and things haven't got better. There's also another element to this, and that's the sugar content in growing up in toddler milks. And I spoke earlier that this is something that I've seen from back whenever I was working in maternal child nutrition. These milks are widely available. They're consumed by children over 12 months, but public health guidance is formula is not necessary after 1 year of age. The main source of free sugar in the diets of 12 to 18-month-olds. And First Steps Nutrition advised that consuming just 350 mils a day of the majority of growing up or toddler milks would result in 1 to 2 year olds consuming significantly more than the recommended 5% energy intake from free sugars. So with tooth decay, the most common reason for hospital admissions among young children, there's a pressing need for mandatory guidelines for sugar content in baby foods and drinks. We need to address the high sugar content, and we need to support the reduction of the number of children who experience tooth decay. We also need to tackle the regulations on the market, the lack of regulations on the market and label of these products. We need transparency. We need to support parents in making healthier choices. We need a ban on child-directed marketing techniques, such as these cartoon characters and games on labels. And there's a wealth of evidence to demonstrate the clear link between food advertising and the food children eat. And food companies spend millions a year on a range of marketing techniques to keep unhealthy food in the spotlight. And one example of this, and I'm off topic at the moment actually, but one example of this is whenever we did the market analysis on baby food pouches, Ella's Kitchen came out and they were one of the ones that had from 4 months up, and they said that they would change their label. And they said they were very sad about the response and disappointed, I think is the word they used. And following that BBC programme, NHS guidance actually has changed to include some information around baby food pouch or baby food meals, really, and advise you just to keep an eye out, choose the ones with the least amount of sugar, salt, and not consume it every day. And interestingly, Ella's Kitchen have flipped the script, which is quite clever marketing too, but they've now got a video out that is a split screen and it shows what it takes to create a meal from home, you know, chopping the veg, boiling it down, the mess at the end, you all your pots and pans in the sink, and then it shows the product, you know, you pop the product into a bowl, and on the other side of the screen it shows you opening the pouch and pouring the product in, and the tagline is more time for cuddles. And so this is what we're up against. And I did say, you know, it's impressive actually, you know, impressive marketing, but it's incredibly frustrating. And it's for, you know, for parents who do, you know, have the time to go through it, to make their meals for the children. But we're not discriminating against parents who don't have that time and who want to choose a baby pouch. That's absolutely fine. But we need to be transparent in what we're giving to the children. So in the face of ongoing oral health and access crisis, prevention's never been more important. And we've talked about, you know, moving from treatment to prevention, and successive governments have been talking about that and the importance of shifting the focus. And it does seem this administration is taking this forward somewhat. I've mentioned the early years toothbrushing scheme. It aims to reach more than 500,000 children, and it actually follows the lead of Scotland and Wales, where they've had similar schemes going for over a decade. And this is fantastic news, and we really hope it will help reduce the oral health inequalities as it's targeted the 20 most deprived communities, 20% most deprived communities. We also have the water fluoridation in the northeast. It's the first scheme in 4 decades, first new scheme in 4 decades, and hopefully it will improve oral health of 1.6 million people in that area. There's also a couple of movements with respect to sugar, and we've got 2 recent proposals. One is on expanding the soft drinks industry levy to sugary milk-based drinks and plant alternatives. And then also the hopefully anticipated ban on energy drinks to under 16s. We also have had some movement on commercial baby foods, but it's voluntary guidance. And it's government have recently published it, but these guidelines encourage manufacturers to reduce salt and sugar. And they can still do certain health claims, but it's about encouraging. We need mandatory measures, and we've seen from Estill that mandatory measures work. I'm aware of time, so I'm not going into the details of it, but we're aware from both evidence in the UK and internationally that we have a greater impact when we have mandatory national level policies. And now we need government to step up and force industry to do the right thing, as they have done with the soft drinks industry levy. And we want them to double down on the fight on sugar. We want mandatory regulation, and we want tried and tested policies from both home and abroad. And we do hope they'll listen and ensure our children have the best start in life. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you so much for coming. If I take 1 or 2 questions, Teresa.
Yeah. I'd just like to say, because my interest in nutrition goes back 40 odd years, and I remember reading an article saying if a malnourished mother is having a baby, gives birth to a malnourished child, and it takes a few generations to get that out, because if you feed that baby, it's still playing catch up. And the thing about sugar, we eat more sugar in a day than they did in a year, a century ago. And I remember asking some people one time, what's white or brown powder and kills millions of people? And they said heroin. It's not actually heroin, it's sugar. And if the sugar industry were taken to court, they would be doing life for manslaughter. They're getting away with it. The government allow them to get away with it. And you're supposed to regulate yourself, and they put the onus on the individual. Children under 4 shouldn't eat any sugar at all apart from whole fruit. And even adults shouldn't have more than 7 grams of sugar a day. And yet some are eating 20, 30, 40. So the government don't care. They spend, is it 9 billion a year on people with diabetes and stuff like that. And we also know that children who haven't been diagnosed have got heart disease and diabetes already. And the numbers are very high because they know by going to the clinical commissioning groups. And I said one time, how come we've got 600 children who've got type 2 diabetes? I said, and they're the ones that have been diagnosed, but there's thousands that haven't. So we've already got the start of heart disease at 5, 6, 7, 8. And my question was, you give MOTs to people over 40, you should be checking children every year so you have healthier adults growing up, the best under the circumstances, and not everyone's circumstances equal. So,
and I think that key point is about prevention, and we're decades behind, to be honest, on prevention, because prevention, and I think it was mentioned, whenever we see governments, they do tend to focus on 5 years of their term, but actually prevention, it will take about 10, 20 years to actually see the benefits, and we've seen that with other countries. And that's the problem we are behind. And it's why we do welcome the shift towards prevention, but it is quite late. And because you say we're already seeing children, I mean, even looking at tooth decay, which is completely preventable. And we're seeing that's the main reason for children being admitted to hospital. And it's young children, it's 5 to 9 years of age.
And could I just say that people are feeding watered down condensed milk to babies because they can't afford 15 or 18 pounds for powdered milk. A decent society would give free powdered milk to babies if you want the best start in life.
I know First Steps Nutrition in particular are doing a lot of work on formula. And that's why whenever I talk about the growing up milks and the toddler milks, I'm not talking about formula milk. Let me be very clear on that. I have no issue with formula milk.
Yeah.
But actually it's the growing up toddler milks that are typically higher in sugar, more expensive. And it's the marketing again of these as well, because they're allowed to be marketed, and they'll talk about stages. You know, you move on to the next stage of formula milk, which doesn't really exist. You can stay on formula, or you can move on to cow's milk or plant-based alternative, not rice milk, until they're 5. But it's that feeding into that, isn't it? As you say, form is fine, but I know there is work being done to try and reduce the inequalities around that and around formula milk.
They want a sick society. That's what they want.
I think, Ian.
Yeah, so what a wonderful, wonderful talk. Thank you. There was some interest. So children are the most likely to be hit. I sort of said that, but they are also the age group with the quickest beneficial impact of top-down policies. So when we looked at the smoking ban, which didn't directly affect children, you know, children weren't going to pubs, Rathi was, but most children weren't going to pubs. You know, most children weren't going to nightclubs.
Yeah.
And yet the smoking ban, we saw an almost immediate, unprecedented reduction in hospitalizations for asthma. And last year there was some work from a group in Edinburgh and Oxford, looking at the impact of the sugar tax on asthma attacks. And it went down like quickly and sustained. So there's a really, so even though even though we know, as you so eloquently put, that the food industry's got a stranglehold on policy, if we can reverse that, we may not need to wait 15 years to see the benefits of that.
It's true, and actually even with, because we do focus on tobacco and vaping, but I find it fascinating. I learned recently we're looking at nicotine pouches that children are placing underneath their lip, and it's not regulated, and they're actually getting so sick they're vomiting because they're obviously huge amounts of nicotine, and it's undetectable. But actually, there's no nicotine toothpicks are available. So it's the constant fight for the next available thing. So it is. It's we always have to be on our toes.
Okay, thanks very much. Just in the interest of time, I'm just going to move to my final speaker. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Jane Coles, who is the National Co-Chair of the Socialist Education Association. And I should say that the Socialist Education Association is our kind of greatest ally in campaigning within the socialist societies and within the Labour Party, and hopefully a new socialist society ally for the future at the back there as well. And Jane is a former teacher, a lecturer and educational researcher in curriculum and pedagogy. So very pleased to have you.
Yeah, so you just introduced me as Dr. Jane Coles, as my daughter has always said over the years, but Mum, you're not a real doctor. And I feel I need to say that in the present company. Thanks very much to the SHA for inviting me to speak this evening. The SEA and the SHA, we coordinated back in May in Oxford, where I'm based these days. We organised a child poverty meeting together, and it attracted well over 100 people on a weekday evening in the centre of Oxford, which just shows, I think, how important an issue this is and how much it kind of has captured the public consciousness as well. And we need to bear that in mind in terms of, I think, taking campaigns forward and bringing pressure to bear from below. And I'll say maybe a little bit more about that later. I'm going to focus on the effects of poverty on educational outcomes. And I suppose you might call it child poverty and educational health, if you like. So it's an oft-quoted truism that in the UK we have more food banks than branches of McDonald's. Less well known is the result of some recent research by Bristol University, researchers at Bristol University. 21% of all primary and secondary schools in England are running food banks, unofficial food banks in schools. That's over 4,000 schools just in England. And that's a clear sign of political failure, isn't it? Schools picking up the pieces in a social system hollowed out by 15 years of austerity, and may I say still going on a year into a Labour government. At its most basic level, hungry children can't learn. But the depth of poverty is the reality of it is truly shocking. According to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, from research they did in 2025, 1 million children experienced destitution. So we've already, I think one of my colleagues on the platform has already said over 4.5 million children are living in relative poverty at this moment. So in 2022, when the Joseph Rowntree Foundation research was actually carried out, 1 million children living in destitution. In other words, families who couldn't afford to keep their children warm, dry, clean and fed. In a recent report, the Children's Commissioner has described almost Dickensian levels of poverty. And what does that mean? Homes without heating, children without beds to sleep in, no kitchen table to eat at, or from an educational perspective, to do your homework at, possibly living in temporary accommodation and constantly being moved around. Now that leads to everyday humiliations for kids at school. It's hard to keep your clothes clean, your hair clean, if in those circumstances. You're probably not able to take part in various activities at school because you don't have the right equipment. Football boots, for instance, to play football in the football club after school. You're in constant trouble for not having done your homework or having you done your homework properly, or carry the right equipment with you. Multi-academy trusts, they're this school system that was brought in by Blair and has been, and then Michael Gove, when he was Educational Secretary, absolutely picked up that particular ball and ran with it. Multi-academy trusts are chains of schools run by private sponsors, but using public money, public funds. So Harold, the CEO of Harris Carpets, for instance, runs a whole chain of schools. Wealthy Tory donors, people like this. And in a lot of these schools, they've introduced zero tolerance behaviour policies. So these kids who aren't getting their homework done, who don't have the right equipment, don't have a pen, whatever, they're the kids who are getting detentions, getting excluded, and so on. So poverty is cited, not surprisingly, as one of the key drivers behind current enormously high rates of pupil absence. You're not going to want to go to school under those circumstances, are you? A recent survey on behalf of the Child Poverty Action Group, which is one of the main charities campaigning around child poverty issues, low-income families struggle to pay for basic school equipment. And we are talking at the level of pens and paper here, never mind appropriate technological devices. And poverty even affects choices at GCSE. So the kids start avoiding certain subjects that incur additional costs. PE, for obvious reasons. Food, because you have to bring, if you're doing food at school, food GCSE, you have to bring ingredients in to cook particular dishes. Music, again, for obvious reasons. Geography, why? Well, school trips, field trips, field courses, that kind of thing. Class-based inequalities are absolutely baked into every aspect of the school system. School test results indicate the achievement gap between children from low-income households and those from well-off backgrounds. And the research shows that that achievement gap is widening. Only 30% of youngsters from low-income families achieve 5 good GCSE passes, and as set against 70% of those from far better off backgrounds. So this really affects people's life chances unequally and translates a huge qualifications gap into childhood. And just one indicator of that is you're 3 times less likely to go on to university if you're from a low-income family. So what should the Labour government be doing? Well, scrapping the 2-child benefit cap. I was assuming I'd be sitting here tonight with that having been announced on a platform during this conference. It hasn't been, even though it was getting trailed earlier. And I think actually in terms of some of the comments made from platform questions earlier, I suspect these are arguments between the Treasury and the Department for Health and Department for Education. And we do have a government, I would say that it's been captured by the Treasury. And it's the Treasury that are making a lot of these decisions. And with a very failed economic model. So, but that child benefit, the 2-child benefit cap, should have been scrapped a year ago as a statement of intent by the newly elected government. Day one, make the announcement of scrapping. 2.5 billion, I think it is estimated at, in terms of the cost of doing that. That's peanuts in the totality of the nation's finances. And we can, as people have already said, as a country, we can afford to pay that. We're the 6th richest economy in the world. And we can't feed kids. So much more is needed though than that. So just scrapping the 2-child benefit cap and even a housing benefit, that kind of thing, making reforms there, that's still not going to solve it from an educational perspective. We're really pleased the SEA, in terms of what we campaign on, the fact of the announcement about setting up family hubs, SHA Start Mark 2, great, get those set up. And again, that they should have been already set up. They've been in government for a year. It's too urgent to be messing about taking time over that. Free breakfast clubs, being mentioned already, being rolled out. Big issue in Bridget Phillipson's speech. Yesterday, I'm losing track of time during that conference. It's a bizarre sort of a shadow existence. But do you know how much the allowance is per child for these breakfast clubs? Total cost 60 pence a head. That includes the additional cost of the cost of the additional staffing and resources needed. Now and as Bridget Phillipson slipped into her speech, something about going to a primary school up in the northeast, seeing these happy smiling children. And she talked about having a couple of slices of toast or whatever. And you're thinking, this is not nutritional. Head teacher unions have already voicing concerns about the sustainability of this on 60p a head and the nutritional quality of provision. So much more needed. We also welcome the recent expansion of the eligibility for free school meals. So all families who are on universal credit, their children will now be eligible for free school meals. But that's great. That's another 500,000 children who are going to be eligible for free school meals. Fantastic. But the problem is, any means tested benefits means that there's always a proportion of those who are eligible who don't take it up. At the moment, it is calculated that around 200,000 children whose families are eligible for free school meals don't claim. That's 14%. That's going to continue unless we get universal free school meals. In London, somebody in the audience who's already left talked about in Wales about universal free school meals. In London, in Sadiq Khan's territory, what Farage thinks is a no-go area across London, they have already introduced universal free school meals for all primary school children. It's been running for a year. The early indicators are that teachers are already seeing significant benefits from that in terms of kids being much more ready to learn, much calmer, fewer behavioural issues and so on. The SEA is also campaigning, and you might not immediately think about teacher recruitment being an issue here, but let me try and join some of those dots. Acute problems at the moment with teacher recruitment and retention. The worst it's been since probably, pre-Second World War. And those problems with teacher recruitment and retention disproportionately affect schools in the most deprived areas of the country. Let me give you an example. 20% of secondary school maths and physics lessons are taught by non-specialists. And let's take a guess. They're not the schools in the most affluent areas who are struggling to appoint well-qualified subject specialists. So we need not only an urgent increase in overall funding in education, but for teachers' pay across the board. We also want to see the government take academised schools back out of private hands and restore local democratic control. We want to stop the rampant profiteering out of children in care or attending alternative provision, who are again disproportionately children from the lowest socioeconomic backgrounds. We want to get rid of the current competition and ranking of schools by performance, which creates huge disparities of intake between the highest performing schools and the lowest. And again, so you end up with schools in areas of low socioeconomic demographic. They're the schools who tend to be seen as the failing schools, and as a kind of cycle then of struggle and sort of, in inverted commas, failure. Instead, we want to see a system based on collaboration rather than competition, where schools are properly embedded in the local communities as a local resource and a local hub. And we want to get away from the idea that educational failure, those children who are failing in the system, that it's down to their individual lack of ambition or personal resilience. So concluding, the moral arguments about reducing child poverty are absolutely obvious, but there are also economic and political ones. The surge of reform on the far right shows what happens when people become alienated and disillusioned, leaving the far right to step into the political vacuum and then demonising migrants and offering false promises of change. It's a ticking time bomb if this isn't tackled. And I'd say the case for significant action on the part of the government is urgent. And as a country, we can afford it. Just look at Tax Justice UK, look at their website, and they've got 10 suggestions for taxation, some of which could be introduced very, very quickly. And that 2.5 billion for scrapping the two-child benefit cap, suddenly you realise how easily realisable that is. So, but I'll finish here. The government's concessions over welfare cuts and school meals, and possibly over the two-child benefit cap coming up over this last year, shows that grassroots activism works. Yeah. Let's continue to campaign for rebuilding our public services, for systemic change in both health and education. And I'll just finish up by saying our sister organisations, the SEA and the SHA, we've got so much in common. I've been, and learning an awful lot on sitting on the platform this evening, and we're stronger when we unite.
Really wonderful way to end. Any last questions?
Yes, it's a question about like 40 years plus of neoliberalism has entrenched social inequality, and child poverty has become normalised and accepted. And we talked about Victorian London. Dickens was able to write quite graphically about what was going on in London, and it had an impact. And I just wonder what in our time would prick the conscience of the nation. I don't watch TV and I don't watch soap operas, but I mean, if we had I don't know if this has ever, does it ever come in? Are there ever any hungry children in these, the kind of programs that people watch regularly? Because when I talk to some people, they seem to be unaware that people in this country people in London are going hungry. People are living in damp houses. Children don't have beds to sleep in, they're sleeping on the floor in mattresses. So I don't know how we actually get that message out there so that people accept it. So it's not about pity or but people are seeing there's something seriously wrong with our society.
I don't know if you remember, going back to COVID, and during the in that first sort of the first when COVID first sort of hit this country, and there was that weird kind of, we had lockdown and that weird it felt like we were living in the kind of introductory chapter of a weird dystopian novel. My background's in English literature, so I can make that analogy. And I remember watching Channel 4 News every evening, because their reporters seemed to be, I thought that there was the best reporting on the issue of any. And probably every week they sent their reporter out into schools around the country, in the primary schools, and they were showing, deputy head teachers, TAs together, and they were just spending their day packing food boxes to take to then driving around the area, delivering food boxes, delivering, paper and pens. And trying to get, online learning for, for lots of families, trying to, when you haven't got proper Wi-Fi, where you're trying to do lessons on a phone, that kind of thing. And they were delivering mattresses as well to homes. And I think that was a massive exposure, a bit like when you talk about Hurricane Katrina, and suddenly that really exposed the underbelly of America, and the kind of the hidden depth of poverty and sort of a racialized poverty. And I think that was a massive exposure, but people forget very quickly. And occasionally there are documentaries, but I think lots of people have really no idea about the depth of the reality of poverty in so many people's lives, and that is still going. The numbers of those families living in poverty is still rising. And one thing that Bridget Phillipson said yesterday in her speech, I'm slightly obsessed with it, is she said something about the breakfast clubs and the expansion of free school meals. She said something that sat more or less, and I can't remember the exact quote, but was we are, by doing this, we are solving issues of child poverty. And of course, what I'm trying to be indicating and trying to sort of, and then join some dots up, is that it goes much wider than that in terms of the way inequality is built into the system, in terms of the educational system, but also clearly in different aspects of the health service as well.
I know you're running out of time. I would follow you. The first time I've heard you speak, that is the best talk on children I have ever heard in my life. Honestly, I would follow that to the ends of the earth. And what you've perfectly outlined in this answer here is that it isn't an accident. It isn't that we've had decades of poverty porn TV programs.
Yeah.
Jeremy Kyle who's resurfaced as some kind of national trap. I've never seen a more disgusting person on TV in my life.
Yeah.
Benefit Street, pointing the finger. And so I've been reflecting about why our bosses in the NHS are so far away from understanding the issues that people have, but also so reluctant to listen. And I think it's because people bought into that superficial, derisory look at working class people. And this is part of the reason Thatcher has blood on her hands. And that's why I can't take even vaguely seriously any Labour politician, which the whole cabinet looks like a Thatcher cabinet to me.
Yes.
And, you know, because she has blood on her hands because of that demonisation of the working class people. And I think for me, this is, you know, we see the difference in Asian kids who come to our clinic with, you know, severe illnesses. One of the beautiful things about being a paediatrician is when kids, we now make them show us their school books. And we pull it in, you know, if you've got a 20-minute appointment, you only need 1 minute to talk about asthma. The other 19 minutes is about Mo Salah, Taylor Swift, who's the boyfriend, what, you know, and what did you do in school? And now they take real pride in this. And we see the difference between the Asian kids and the black kids and the working class white children from isolated white poverty. And I remember isolated white poverty because that's what Middlesbrough was. Teesside was isolated white poverty. And they were just born into this world where they were immediately thrown in the bin. And you know, they were born into this world where there was such little aspiration for them. Why should they have aspiration for them? If there's a void there and you are made to feel like you are a second-rate person, you know, and I can't tell you enough about the story that landed with me was did a talk for, I don't remember which union there was, and I said that line, you know, dinner ladies are the interface between nutrition and child health and education. And there was a dinner lady, and that 60 pence is hard. I mean, that is just an indictment. That shows how much you mean to me. You know, you're a tick box. And she said that when she was you know, when she's at the till, she has to take food away from kids who can't afford it. And I said, who is this company? I am going for them.
Yes.
Lancashire County Council, right? The boss is standing behind it. So when she's in that situation, I said, what happens next? They slink off into the canteen and they're sharing food with each other. Children know how to do this. And she said that when she was on free school meals at school, it was easier and there was less stigma for her to pretend that she wasn't eating lunch because she had an eating disorder, which she didn't have, than to say my dad's got a gambling problem, right? So honestly, what you've said is better than any health person I've ever heard talk. It is about the future, and thank you.
Can I just say, even the majority, the polling shows that even the majority of people who say they're going to vote reform are in favour of progressive tax reforms. So, you know, I mean, this should be, I mean, given that the Labour Party, God, I'm going to get thrown out, I think, after saying it, but given the Labour government seem to be constantly shadowing, chasing the tail of barrage and reform, and yet, you know, there's something that clearly is very popular, but they're not, but they seem to be shying away from it. So, you know, it's difficult to comprehend that they could be doing so many things that actually would be very popular, but would also put clear blue water between them and the putative reform voters. So, you know, I mean, whatever we can do, I think, to you know, collaborate and try and, you know, draw more people in and more people into our particular campaigns, the better. And, you know, children, they only have one childhood.
Yes.
And, you know, that a child that's in school at the moment who is, let's say the age of 10, and we know that disaffection increases massively as when they transfer from primary to secondary school. So a child who's 10 now and becoming alienated from school, they're not doing well in tests. My God, our kids Our kids in British schools are the most tested kids throughout the whole of Europe. You know, and if testing was the solution to things, we would have, you know, we would have the happiest and the most highest achieving kids in the world. We don't. So if we, you know, the kids coming up to secondary school age, they're 10-year-old now, beginning to feel alienated, beginning to feel disillusioned and disengaged from school. The 4 years of a government, I'm just saying, we'll try and improve, you know, child poverty by the end of our time in government. That kid is probably already will more or less have finished secondary school. May even by then have be too late. They've probably been excluded by then. You know, so they don't have another chance. So the urgency of this for those children in the system now, the urgency could not be more crucial.
So I think that's a really good way to close the session. Children have really dropped off the agenda. They're not featured at the conference at all. They're not being discussed. Some of us saw this morning the NEU had brought some local school children out to talk about the free school meals campaign, and the amount of people in very, very expensive looking suits that just walked past them.
Oh my God.
For free school meals from primary school kids.
Yeah.
So, you know, I agree that we need to put this back on the agenda, and I think, sorry, Felicity, did you want to say something? Yeah. No, what I was going to say in closing is, and I know Elaine's had to leave, but I think we've been very lucky to have these 4 speakers here, and I think that they've put together actually for us, you know, a really clear picture of what's happening. I think it's a national scandal, and I agree. I do hope that this is the start of not just a random meeting, but I hope this is the start of us kind of coordinating and working together and starting to build something. And thanks very much for coming. Please do leave your contact details if you'd like to stay in touch. But yeah, I'll draw this meeting to a close, and thank you so much for your attention.